I'm Genevieve Randall, music director with Nebraska Public Media. We are so pleased to support Lincoln Symphony Orchestra with these pre-concert chats. These concerts are so great, and this one is the season finale for this season called Pictures at an Exhibition, which is, depending on when you're watching this pre-concert chat, Sunday, May 5th at 6 p.m. at the Lead Center for Performing Arts. By the way, some of LSO's concerts can be heard on Nebraska Public Media statewide on our occasional series, Nebraska Concerts. So keep an eye out for that. I want to start this pre-concert chat by giving a hearty welcome to our guests here for this chat. Of course, Ed Polachek, music director, and our maestro. Ed, great to see you as always. I love the salute. It's good. We have got an LSO musician here who is a featured soloist on this concert in Darcy Gamrell, oboist and English horn player. That comes into play here in a moment. Darcy, great to see you.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
And a featured composer here on this particular program is Dr. James Lee III. And I have to admit, he's got, let me see, I got to check my notes, 80 works for orchestra, chamber ensemble, piano, vocals, choral ensemble, and more. He is also composer in residence for the 2024-25 season with the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra. Amazing. And I'm ashamed to admit that I am becoming now more familiar with your work, but did not know as much. And I'm so excited to meet you. Thank you for being here.
Oh, it's good to be here. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, let's dive in here with this piece, which Darcy had a lot to do with. I also wanted to tell you, I watched Stefan Deneve, conductor Stefan Deneve, talking about you, and he says that your music is a blessing. Did you know that?
I did. Yeah, I think he mentioned that at the last premiere. I think I had a premiere in January last year. He mentioned that, and then the same piece played with the New World Symphony in Miami. So I know those are fairly recent comments.
I take a look here at these titles, and I think this is true. There's a lot of, what I want to say, personal investment, a lot of personality in your music. And this is definitely the same. It's called Courageous Lights, which references three women who are a part of this piece. But let's talk about first, before we get to these three women, this started, I understand, when Darcy was working in radio, actually, with our friends at KVNO, which is just down the road from Nebraska Public Media. How did this go from an interview, Darcy, that you did with James into a piece?
Well, yeah, I was working at KVNO. I had gotten the job as music director about 6 months before the pandemic started, and then everything shut down. So it was, I don't know, divine intervention, perhaps. I don't know, but here we are. And we were doing a podcast highlighting new music by composers that aren't traditionally programmed. And so I was I came across James's work, and really it has such a strong voice and so much behind it, so much depth and emotion. And so I asked if he might be interested in doing an interview just to learn a little bit more about his compositional process. And we had a wonderful conversation. And I think this is how I remember it. We'll have to see how James remembers it. But I think basically I pulled a John Delancey. So John Delancey was the principal oboist of the Philadelphia Orchestra, and he met Richard Strauss in Europe during World War II. And he asked Strauss if he had ever thought about writing an oboe concerto. And Strauss said no, and that was the end of the story. But then he wrote one for him, and Delancey ended up premiering it later in Philadelphia. So I asked him, he said how much he loved the English horn. It was one of his favorite instruments. And I said, well, have you ever thought about maybe writing, a concerto? And he said, oh, no, not really. So I got the same answer, but then the same result happened. I heard back from him, and he said, I think I would like to write something. So that's where we started, and the conversation went from there.
Beautiful. The English horn has such an amazing sound. Just
Yes.
absolutely. There's something about the tone and timbre of the English horn. So I want to bring this back to the three women who are honored with this music. James, tell us about the three women, why you chose them, and what makes the English horn the right voice for this piece.
Well, first of all, in regards to English horn, I had noticed that various African American composers used it prominently in their works, especially William Grant Still in his Afro American Symphony, and then works by William Dawson as well in his Negro Folk Symphony using the instrument.
Right.
And as I thought more about that and my own use of it in a Baltimore Symphony Commission about Harriet Tubman years ago, this felt natural to me. So then in my conversations with Darcy, she actually suggested these three women and that I look into them and kind of think about what I might want to do in terms of writing a new concerto. You know, I have so many things going on. It's hard for me to sit down and really think about an extra musical program very quickly. So she was very helpful in giving me at least some initial inspiration. So then as I continued to read about these three women, I thought, you know, this is wonderful. Each of them are activists in their own spheres of influence and shedding light on these very important topics and uplifting the various people in their community. And I thought this would be perfect. And how courageous, of course, in my title of especially Malala after what she had gone through. And then the Native American woman whose name was translated as Redbird, her experience. And then, of course, Amanda Gorman and her wonderful poem for Biden's inauguration. So I thought this would work so well, even organically, so it would feel so natural once I move from movement to movement and structuring this. And this idea of this always ascending line, like in the first movement on up to the end of the concerto, in terms of having this this bright outlook and hopeful attitude in terms of uplifting one or one's culture, one's overcoming one's obstacles within that community.
It's
So
brilliant.
Pictures in an Exhibition is on this concert, and it's interesting that here we've got a concerto that is pictures of actual people who've greatly influenced society. How, I want to use the word literal, but that's not quite right with music, is it? How much is it actually painting a picture in each section of these women? Or is it more like you're talking about the emotion, the inspiration behind what they represent?
Well, sure. Each movement actually has music that kind of musically comments on various aspects of their life or even of their work. For example, in the first movement, it literally starts with these kind of ascending figures, almost like in a minor type mode. Most of my music is not necessarily functional harmony, but they are allusions to tonal centers, and you can actually have moments of accessibility combined with moments of high density in terms of the textures and chromaticism. So in the first poem, I thought about Amanda's text in her call for light and unity. Those are two aspects of what she talked about in her poem. So there's always this idea of this ascension that happens in that first movement, for example, and overcoming various challenges. And then in the second movement, one of the challenges is that Zitkala Shah's or Redbird's objective was to try to get citizenship for her for the people in her nation and to uplift them. And what's interesting is that there's this tug of war that occurred in her life where she was perceived as being uncivilized or being wild. So that kind of plays out in that second movement. And then one thing I forgot to mention in the world premiere of this in Augusta, I actually quoted My Country 'Tis of, was it My Country 'Tis of, no, not My Country, the national anthem. Yeah, the Star Spangled Banner. I actually did that. And it's kind of comes at the end, but it's almost in a darker minor mode how it occurs, and the melody is augmented. So it's like, oh, say, can you see? But the interval is actually different. It's like a minor seventh at the top. And it kind of speaks to the fact where she, of course, struggled for that citizenship with her fellow men and women in her culture. But then is she really indeed so-called civilized? So that is in the second movement. And then in the last movement starts with this kind of action already in progress with Malala and her yearning, et cetera, et cetera. So I actually played around with these melodic, these rhythmic figures that are supposed to represent her name, Malala. So that three syllable name is heard in a melodic and rhythmic figure in the English horn, and then of course the dialogues in the orchestra.
Darcy,
But
talk. Sorry, Ed, I don't mean to keep.
you know, one of the things that I've noticed and why I love the title Courageous Lights, along with the depth of the music, is that all three of these portraits, you might say, have great depth of meaning, both musically and spiritually, in a certain sense. If you know about the lives of each of these women, it has to do with that no matter what, that light can never be extinguished in any way, shape, or form. It always shines. It always goes forward. And that's one of the things that I find very unique about this particular piece, that it keeps on going, that it's always there. And when the English horn then, comes out of its depths and from this gorgeous dark sound into the higher registers, you always feel that it is ascending, and that light is eternal, and so that each of the movements has its own separate character. Particularly in the second movement, that what distinguishes it is that you have a lot of references to, I don't know if they're actual Native American melodies or things that you have, James, that you have composed in the style of, but it's really quite wonderful, and it's a great middle movement that sets off the other two, and they are women of diverse backgrounds, different areas, and incredible life struggles to overcome, which makes their light eternal. And that's why I love this piece of music, because I hear it in the music and I see it in my mind's eye with doing it. And that's what I love about this. It's brilliant, James. It really is.
Well, thank you. That's something that I really was striving to do, actually, in my own outlook in life, in terms of being a light in this world, which is full of so many ideas and concepts of darkness. Always that persistence in providing light and uplifting in terms of my own musical output. So that's what I try to achieve, especially in this concerto.
I want to hear from Darcy a little bit about what it's like to learn a new piece like this, especially when it's one that you sort of were the initial spark for. You planted the seed for this. But, a lot of musicians are used to playing music that they've heard their whole entire lives and have heard over and over again. It's a whole new, exciting kind of thing to learn brand new music like this.
That's right.
How is that from your perspective, Darcy?
It is a very different experience, for sure. It's really kind of a discovery process, and I feel like James and I very much align in terms of bringing, optimism and light to the world and trying to encourage people. And in the case of this particular piece, bringing it to life for people to inspire other people to give them hope, to give them something to hold on to. And so I guess, in my preparation for the premiere and for this upcoming concert, it really was a real journey to go through each of the movements and to try to bring them to life. And I think people will find that it's really a powerful piece.
Very, very much so. Very much
Very
so.
cool. Well, and this piece is paired with, as I mentioned, Mussorgsky's Pictures in an Exhibition, as well as a piece by Kenji Bunch, who admittedly is a composer I've loved for a long time, called Groovebox Fantasy. And it's just a fun, rhythmic, and if I may, groovy piece that even tempo markings, there's a part where I think it says relentless groove in the
Yep, that's what it
the
is.
tempo marking. Um, I wondered if being in a groove, if that came from record albums. It occurred to me today. I was like, wait,
Ah!
you say that because it comes from LPs that were in a groove? I don't know. But Ed, this is interesting because we've got two pieces on the program by living composers and one piece by in that traditional classical main repertoire, category or folder. Um, what are the musicians seeing on Groovebox on their sheet music? I think that would be an interesting thing for the audience to think about because as they hear it, they'll hear the groove. They get into a groove and there's these repeated figures. But what is the orchestra seeing on the page?
You can't help but get into the groove almost immediately. The way Kenji, I love the way Kenji Bunch writes certain things. He's kind of this amalgamation of hip hop, jazz, funk, mixed with the traditional classical European classical music style. But what he did here, and he wrote it during the pandemic, which I think is important to know because it's the type of piece that you can put together in separate rooms, all over the place. Each player can do his or her thing and then put together, as long as you have a click track, doing it. And that's why it works, because the groove it's about 108 to the metronome mark,
Yeah.
and each measure is repeated 3 times. So it's played 4 times. All the way through until you get to the very end. And then there's this very kind of quick wham bam thank you ma'am coda of 8 measures that goes boom and you're off. But it is definitely grooving music. It has that feeling of kind of bluegrassy or funky rhythm to it, but it's relentless. And I think it's a great opener for this program. I really do. That's why I chose it.
So does that all fit on one sheet? You don't have to turn pages for the music?
Probably so, because my score is the thinnest score I've ever had.
Just the one measure, repeat, and then you can move on to the next one.
Exactly. Interesting. So though you don't get the feeling of it being monotonous in terms of you actually get carried along with the groove, because it keeps on. It's almost like a variation of not somewhat tonally, but certainly rhythmically, and the colors that he just keeps on adding and piling on top of it until it just explodes at the end. It's a great setup for Courageous Lights. I think it's gonna be fun. It's gonna be a lot of fun.
So there's a few YouTube recordings of Groovebox, just a few, because like you said, it was written during the pandemic, so it's pretty new. But James, that brings me back to another idea and question that I would love to hear you address. And Darcy, if you want to weigh in on this too. There is the question, I counted about a dozen or more symphonies across the country, James, that have, including Omaha, that have premiered your works. Talk to me about the life of new music after the premiere.
Good question.
That's a good question. I mean, in general or in terms of my own experience?
Well, absolutely from your own experience for sure. But if you have other general thoughts, I think it's we get really excited about premieres, in orchestra concerts, and you'll see them, but the audience leaves the hall, they go home and feed the cat or whatever they're doing. And then when do they hear this piece again? I want audience members to think about that.
Sure. Well, it depends. In terms of my own experiences, I usually try to write or collaborate with orchestras working on a program that would fit so that if other orchestras were interested in that same program, then it would be like a companion piece, so something that would make sense for it to be programmed in the future. So ideally, that is one way it can happen. And then, of course, one of the best ways is to have recordings of the works, like commercial recordings. And that is something that I've been continually working on, and actually have had more success with lately with some things that have been recorded and are talked about being recorded. And then my residence at Baltimore will allow my new concertos for this coming season to be recorded. And then there's talk about there's talk about this concerto being recorded, and then the work with the St. Louis Symphony that is already recorded and waiting to be released. So ideally, recordings and just future buzz in terms of the administrations and conductors, especially how they can fit that particular work so it makes sense in the overall scheme of programming. I think that is very helpful to both conductors, composers, and audience members who are looking to hear certain pieces again. And I've been really blessed that some pieces of mine, someone's playing it like every year somewhere. And even like one of them is even getting more international experience as well, so, or exposure. So
Fabulous,
yeah.
fabulous. I also think that orchestras over the last, say, decade or so, certainly pre-pandemic, have come into, particularly orchestras that do more than one performance per program. Where and the increased how could I say it, the way recording engineering has become such a great kind of an occupation unto itself, in that you can make a recording that sounds like a studio recording during a live performance. And if you have multiple performances of those, you can patch in what you need to do and also patch at the end, so that the actual recording session is not as expensive as it used to be, where you'd have to get the entire ensemble together, you'd have to rehearse it, you'd have to put it together, and then you have to record it. It kind of becomes as a unit. And I've seen so many of those, and I love when I hear those kinds of recordings, to hear the applause at the end, because it lets me know that it is a live performance. And I love the idea that live performances go out there as commercial recordings, even with the glitches that might happen and all that kind of thing, because there's a certain spark that happens in a live performance that cannot happen in a studio recording at all. And a lot of that has to just do with the excitement of the audience in there, and the excitement that the orchestra gets playing it for the audience. Everybody's feet are put to the fire, and you have to produce. And so there's a great deal of excitement there. And that's and I was going to say it even with what we're doing, and I think it's very important for orchestras to identify great music of living composers and present it to their audience. It's also important to repeat those performances and figure out which music you think is going to be heard again 50 years from now or 100 years from now. What is going to survive? It reminds me of years ago, Paul Zacher, who was the music director for the Basel Chamber Orchestra in Switzerland. He just sought out a whole bunch of composers, including Delius and Taillefer and Honegger and Ravel, earlier Ravel, things that nowadays we consider pretty much standard, but in those days was not at all. But he made sure that they recorded those so that they can be played, so they can be aired, so that people can get more and more familiar with it. And I think that's where we're at with this new. It's great to be doing new pieces all the time, but it's also important to be able to repeat them also.
Well, we are running very, very short on time, but I have one question to ask Ed about the Mussorgsky pictures at an exhibition before we close out here. And that's because I got to thinking about the fact that I actually didn't know for many years as I, was growing up a fan of classical music, that Mussorgsky's pictures started out as a piano work.
That's
And
correct.
so my question for you is, what if Ravel had not orchestrated it? What would have happened?
Then there would have been 100 other composers who would have orchestrated it, and in fact have. And you can hear some of those orchestrations, but I always end up going back to the Ravel. It's interesting because Modest Mussorgsky was one of these musicians who was, like so many composers in those days, was ushered into a different kind of profession. Didn't want them to go into music because it wasn't so lucrative, et cetera, et cetera. So he was only semi-educated as a musician, but obviously extremely talented. And there were other composers like Ravel, but particularly Rimsky-Korsakov, and other Russian composers who would then do a lot of orchestration for Mussorgsky. His opera Boris Godunov is another example of that. And there have been other Russian composers who have fallen into that same category. But the piano piece itself, which I played years ago, is a fantastic piece of music. It really is. But what Ravel did with it, I think, elevated the piece into a much more popular status than if it had just stayed as a piano piece. I really do believe that. And Ravel, like Rimsky-Korsakov, was one of the greatest orchestrators ever. The colors, the use of instruments, the way he actually translated all of this percussive playing on the keyboard into this lushness of wind and brass and string and percussion music. It's a very powerful piece. I love doing this. I haven't done it in like 15 years. I'm really looking forward to this. I haven't done it in a while.
Well, this is surely a grand finale for the season finale for Lincoln Symphony Orchestra. We've been talking here with composer James Lee III, whose piece, Courageous Lights, I almost said Continuous Lights. It will be continuous when people.
It is both.
Right?
Yeah.
Courageous Lights, a concerto for English horn based on 3 outstanding women activists. And Darcy Gamrell here is the featured soloist who will be featured on James Lee's piece. We also will hear Kenji Bunch's Groovebox Fantasy to kick off the concert, quite the kickoff to a concert, and Mussorgsky's massive Pictures at an Exhibition orchestrated by Ravel, all led by our beloved Ed. Maestro Ed.
Love Ed. I love it. Thank you. Thank you. Oh,
Thank you all for being part of this pre-concert chat. I really appreciate it.
it's great.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much.
Thank you.